China's culture industry has grown to over 3 trillion RMB, or about 450 billion US dollars. That accounts for over 4% of China's total GDP. It has turned into the largest culture market in terms of published books, TV dramas, and movies. During the CPC's 90th National Congress, General Secretary Xi said culture is a country's soul. He also spent quite a lot of time in the report talking about how to nurture not only traditional culture but also that of modern life, saying the nation will only be strong if its culture is strong. And let's listen in.
Without full confidence in our culture, without a rich and prosperous culture, the Chinese nation would not be able to rejuvenate itself. We must develop a socialist culture with Chinese characteristics, inspire the cultural creativity of our whole nation, and develop a great socialist culture in China.
That's a quote coming from Xi Jinping. For more on China's cultural soft power and many other issues related to it, we are joined here in our Beijing studio by Mr. Huang Ping. Long time no see, sir. Co-chair of the International Institute Transculture and also co-organizer of China-EU High-Level Cultural Forum. Welcome to our program. Also joining us to have in our studio once again, David Moser, Senior Advisor at the Yanqing Academy at Peking University, a master's degree program for foreign and Chinese college students to learn about Chinese culture.
That's right.
Welcome as well, David. I want to start with you, Mr. Huang. There's a lot of talk about culture, but certainly culture does not just mean cultural industries. It's not just money-wise. It's a lot more than that. How far are we from that term, so-called culture?
For me, but also for especially sociologists, anthropologists, historians, culture firstly means a set of ways of living, of thinking, of communicating each other, of the very ordinary people. And behind, it's a meaning of life, how people see a set of norms, values. Therefore, culture does not only belong to those cultural people in arts, in performances, in culture industry, but also actually belongs to everyone.
Yeah. Having said that, though, how much do we really talk about culture these days in our daily conversations? You know, China is on the run. David, you know this much better than anybody else. You've been in China for decades, observing how China is evolving. Economic development has been regarded as the top priority. Of course, things have changed, but how much culture is really in our daily conversation?
Yeah, culture tends to be associated, as Professor Huang said, with the elevated aspect of life, those lofty things like philosophy. And culture is actually a very neutral term that just actually refers to all the aspects of life that distinguish one particular civilization or peoples from another. So actually culture, if you come to China, the first thing you realize is this is a very, very different culture as a foreigner. And it's not just in its arts or its letters, but it's in its food, it's in its daily life, it's in its relationships between people. And I think that that's something that China, as it becomes well-known, more well-known now in the 21st century, more people are able to come here. That aspect naturally gets exported in terms of the people who are influenced by to come here, and that's all culture.
China is not lack of cultural phenomena, and yet there has been apparently a lack of real research into the cultural phenomena. You talk about the food or the tea or the interactions among the people. Professor Huang, in the specific speech given by Xi Jinping, he has also been talking about earlier about his responsibility as the head of state and as also the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, the ruling party, to not to forget and not let the Chinese society forget about the 5,000-year-old traditional Chinese culture. Of course, you could argue traditional Chinese culture is only part of the Chinese culture. And yet, what about that big chunk of the Chinese culture? Professor Huang, Have we done much research about that? Do we know much about our own culture, given the absence of research over the past decades, let's just say in the Chinese society and also in the Chinese schoolings?
I would think we have lots of research on culture from culture perspective, even in order to understand economic development, but from the cultural dimension. No mentioning of those research of our own history, literature, etc. But there is a kind of differences between a very consciousness or awareness of your own culture and something just take it for granted. So for many ordinary people, hundreds of millions of people, they took it for granted without necessarily recognizing with such a full consciousness.
Give me an example, if you can, sir.
Giving you an example, when Xi Jinping talks about the cultural confidence, he definitely means we need to be more consciousness about our own culture, values, norms, rather than naturally let it go. Say thousands of years, of course, continuity of the culture, very rich traditions, diversities of the Chinese cultures, etc., etc. It has been there. But as you said, during the past decades, several decades already, they emphasized so much on economic growth. Development
and before
first.
that, political campaigns.
Yeah, development first, economy first. But if you look at actually for the much longer history, and how even in order for a sustainable development, for inclusive development, for development for all, benefits to all, cultural dimension must be there, and actually must be a foundation.
David, I know earlier we talked about this, and you disagree that traditional culture should, occupy a big chunk of the culture that we are talking about today when it comes to Chinese culture. What do you think is the Chinese culture, and what to you is the most treasurable, let's just say, as an observer?
Well, for me, you don't want to ask me because I'm very much an academic. What attracted me first and still attracts me a lot to Chinese culture is the traditional philosophy. And I always thought that was one of China's great contributions to the world, was its philosophy. That's not something that most Americans or most people care about. However, with China's rise and with more people understanding it, we are seeing many books written by Western scholars, American scholars, explaining Confucianism, explaining aspects of Chinese philosophy and thought to undergraduates at Harvard and different places, and saying, look, this is another way of conceptualizing the human sphere, and it's a very interesting one. And it has
Give me an example, if you can.
I can't think of the name right now, but there's a Harvard professor who has written a book talking about Confucianism and its relevance to American life. In fact, there's several books that try to do that. So that's one aspect. Chinese traditional culture is obviously the first thing you think of when you think of Chinese culture, the 5,000-year aspect. The calligraphy, of course, the food, the different aspects of the culture, its long history, its literature. But there's this other aspect that you see in like the modern culture, with the analog being K-pop, whereas Chinese modern culture that has this soft power attraction, which can attract people even if they're not interested in China per se. They're interested in that phenomenon, in that music, or in that piece of art. That's what needs to happen in China, and it is happening, but the question is, when will China have its K-pop, or when will it have its jazz music, or Hollywood movies, or and this is something China is making headway in, but I think that China needs to get over the notion that their biggest selling point and all they have is its 5,000-year history. There's still a very vibrant new culture arising domestically, but they haven't been very successful in exporting it.
Interesting to talk about that, because there has been a lot of discussion of so-called the 4 new inventions of modern China, namely mobile pay, fast-speed trains, things like that. That make people think about a fact that what is China invention? Of course, those technologies are from overseas originally. And yet, with the China market and the China practice and update, it has changed overall. And that is exactly what we talk about, the so-called, whether it's jazz or a movie or TV plays. All of these genres are not invented by China, so-called. It's coming from overseas, while China was learning over the past 4 decades, reform and opening up. But eventually, can China play it well, quote unquote, with all these things that they have learned from others? Or China will play it so well with the things that it originally has and originally invented? What exactly is China's advantage if we consciously discuss about this? Professor Huang.
I would think either traditional or
but
modern...
of course, on the other hand, does it
Yes.
really matter?
But either traditional or modern culture or Chinese culture, one thing you can see in common. That is, Chinese culture and society and the people has been very open, learning. Nowadays we use the term inclusive. So it's a mixed, very mixed, multiple cultures.
Diversity.
Yeah, diversities. From within also towards the outside. That's how you have taken those examples, how China absorbed or taken or integrated, and also have its own input. It's a kind of mixture. But again, I think there has been a continuity there. That is openness, inclusiveness, and kind of learning attitudes, not only for our long history, but towards the outside, towards the future. And especially this is especially true amongst the younger generations.
David, you want to say something?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And one of the dynamism of the United States soft power is in fact that most of those forms that we think of, like rock and roll, are actually the result of this confluence of different cultural aspects. You know, you have the black African slaves that were brought, you have classical music, you have all these sorts of influences. These are what create vibrant new art forms. China has cultural diversity. It needs to not be afraid of it. It needs to revel in it. It needs to allow its traditional forms, its musical forms, its calligraphy and everything, to change and evolve with the results of these foreign and outside, and even within its multicultural interior, and let new sort of forms arise. And I think one problem with China is it tends to be conservative with its old forms. It tends to say, well, but if you change Peking opera into this, it won't be Peking opera anymore. China needs to get away from that and say, we welcome change, we welcome and we welcome input from the outside world.
Our discussion has become abstract, but at the same time very vivid, because this is such a huge topic, probably beyond any topic that we have ever discussed here in this program. When it comes to culture, it is about diversity. It is also about space and freedom to create diversity, and there are many other topics related to all of this. But for now, I want to thank all of you for being with us. Huang Ping, David Moser, really appreciate it. Thank you. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Have a great weekend.